Gauri, Satam. My thesis topic is restoring Charkop's intertidal wetlands and reinstating the socio-cultural landscape of its Koliwada. Starting with Mumbai with its estuarine setting has always been a landscape of negotiations between land and water, be it tidal or seasonal variations. These have been best understood and optimized by the aboriginals, the Kolis of Mumbai. So I have taken up the case of Charkop Koliwada, which is a western suburb of Mumbai. So, before getting to my thesis intent, I would like to give a background of our Charkop. So, the landscape setting of Charkop. Charkop is a western suburb of Mumbai, nestled along the coastal edge of the Malad Creek. So, starting with the history of Charkop, early in 1900s, Charkop was an aboriginal fishing island, as small as just 75 acres in area. It was a community of Son Kolis who practiced fishing and paddy farming on this small island. In 1940s, it was the Britishers who brought in the Kandivali industrial estate very close to Charkop village, and they kind of, after establishing the industrial estate, they also made bund walls as offshore breakwaters with sluice gates, probably with an idea of further land reclamation. In 1985, with the growing housing demands of the city, MHADA came up with the affordable housing project by landfilling these breakwaters. So today, Charkop is somewhat on these lines, where this is the boundary of Charkop Gao, which once existed, with the Charkop Koliwada, which is kind of now strangulated and alienated in itself. Charkop Koliwada is surrounded by the planned development shown in yellow, by Kandivali Industrial Estate, which is shown in purple. And this Koliwada is also threatened by some informal settlements which happen along the fringes. Apart from the Koliwada, this whole Charkop Gao has the coastal wetlands on one side and these intertidal wetlands on the other side, which is like a buffer between the new city and Koliwada, which was left during the master planning. So coming to these two different types of wetlands which exist around the Koliwada, the coastal wetlands, which have been very recently recognized as 136 hectares of reserved forest, are pretty much protected with a very rich avifauna of its own, while the other intertidal wetlands, which are about mangrove forests with brackish marshlands, are yet to be identified by the authorities, hence threatened. So my thesis intent is basically segregated into two layers of the place and of the people. So I'll be looking into the ecological layer of establishing the importance of these intertidal wetlands, assessing the threats, reviving the wetland ecology, and regaining the lost urban resilience. In the socio-cultural layer, I'll be studying the rich heritage of Charkop's Koliwada, assess the threats and the needs, reinstate a sense of identity within the Koliwada, and create accessible, sustainable, utilitarian landscapes. So it's about connecting the place with the people through a landscape of negotiations. So starting with my first layer of Charkop wetlands as sponges of resilience. Charkop, as I said, was once an intertidal zone, now a landfill site, which lies between the Manori Creek and the Poisar River. The wetlands of Charkop played a very critical role in absorbing the high monsoon rains during the 2005 deluge, as seen in this plan, which acted as the sponges of resilience. If we compare the maps of 2004 to 2020 and see how these sponges have gradually been, reduced, and the region is kind of losing its resilience over time due to the urbanization. If we try to study the topographical section of Charkop Koliwada, we have the saline waters of the coastal wetlands on one side and the brackish waters with the intertidal wetlands on the other side. Along the hillock of Charkop Koliwada, we also have a freshwater lake called Dingeshwar Talao, which is aquifer fed and was the only source of water at one point of time to the Koliwada. So it has a very diverse hydrogeological condition in itself. Coming to the intertidal wetlands, what they were once as these sponges, as you can see, and what they have turned out to be today by being landfilled, by encroached, repurposed, and channelized into a concrete gutter, something on these lines. So wetlands like these being compromised into and channelized into drains like these. So, also trying to understand what the future of these wetlands is, how have they been demarcated on the DP? These wetlands have been demarcated primarily as open spaces, but some of them have also been converted into residential land use. But these open spaces are again shown as gardens or playgrounds and very generic land use, not kind of acknowledging them as the sponges of this region. I've also studied all these wetland patches in detail and tried to understand the different issues they face in terms of uh, ecological degradation, the fragmentation, a disconnect with the creek ecology, encroachments from different ends, land filling, channelization, and basically no access to these wetlands, hence a social neglect. Charkop's intertidal wetlands play a very important role as ecosystem service providers by serving flood control, groundwater replenishment, shoreline stabilization, stormwater protection, water purification, and importantly as reservoirs of floral and faunal diversity. So even if we just see the value of the flood control, what these Charkop wetlands have to offer to Charkop, the value goes to as much as 2,200 crores for this 11 hectares of land. Also studying the wetlands in terms of the climate change and the rising sea levels, it becomes very critical of to kind of save these wetlands, assuming that a lot of the planned charcoal would probably submerged and waterlogged with the sea level rises over the coming years. Coming to my second layer of people that is studying the Charkop Koliwada. Charkop Koliwada, as I said, is a 75 acres of about a small island, today a part of the mainland. This is kind of the character of it, with a close-knit community of 3,000 fisher folks, narrow lanes, no vehicular access, threatened by encroachments along fringes, and alienated from its surrounding. It has certain amount of open spaces, but still deficit of it. The only open spaces that are maintained is the Dingeshwar Talab, which has a religious value to it, and the water is still potable and used by the people. It also has, hints of sustainable practices like vegetable farms, banana plantation, toddy plantations as some remnants in the landscape today. So these are some of the issues, the overall landscape that has been sketched together in the same layers. Trying to understand the socio-cultural practices that were once prevalent in this region. The intertidal zones which once existed today are now landfilled were, before 1985, the intertidal wetlands were a biodiverse sanctuary of aquatic fauna, an important source of food and livelihood for the artisanal fisher folks. And the loss of these intertidal zones has led to a loss of livelihoods to the natives. Apart from fishing, paddy farming, and an extensive landscape of toddy farms was prevalent once. Some of the gullies of this Koliwada were actually named by the places or the landscape they kind of headed to. So we had the Shegat Gully, we had the One Gully, we had the Taki Gully, where, which led to a local breweries which use the local fruits to brew, local alcohol, which was very popular at one point of time. The setting is also rich with its cultural markers with 6 different temples which happen. Charkop Koliwada is also unique because it is one of the only few Koliwadas which does not have a church in it. It has a community of only these Sonkolis which reside, with a history to it as well, why it didn't have any Christians there. Coming to the different cultural markers, one of them being the Machi market. From the Machi market, we can see the multiplicity, the adaptability to temporal needs. What these smaller inserts within the community, these social inserts kind of, change with time, with festivities from day to day as well. We also have these festivals like, Vaishak Shuddha Panchami, which is like a 2-day jatra that happens. The Dingeshwar Talab is used for Ganpati Visarjan also, where people from the entire Charkop neighborhood come to immerse their idols. I've also tried to map. So the above is an annual activity mapping showing the rich, diverse, and intangible culture this community of Sonkolis has, which the city has failed to acknowledge, document, preserve, and celebrate. So this is a collage of the pictures which I could gather from the Sonkolis whom I have been interacting to. Such a beautiful, colorful community which has been forgotten, not celebrated, and alienated in a way. So trying to understand what the threats this community faces, right from a disconnect with the profession because of a loss of their landscape, which was intertidal, to a deficit of basic amenities like open spaces or a crematorium, to inadequate infrastructural connections, no road coming in, Infrastructural threats like the coastal road is actually cutting across the Koliwada very insensitively. There is also gentrification, like a pressure from these informal settlements which are coming up along the fringes. And importantly, an identity crisis, an alienation, a disconnect with the land that has happened with this community. So this is the current alignment of the coastal road, and this is the demarcation of the Koliwada done by the BMC, leaving no buffer to them, and in a way strangulating the Koliwada. Further, apart from the Koliwada, yeah, thank you, ma'am. Apart from the Koliwada, I have also studied the open spaces in the region, and I have understood that within a radius of 1 kilometer, although Charkop is a planned development, it only has 3% of accessible greens. So the user analysis, starting with my user analysis, who are the users, starting from the middle class, mid-rise, high-rise apartments to the low-rise housing societies, to the coolies, to the informal migrants, to the industrial estate workers as well. So the same have been plotted on this site, and the different accesses from which they would be probably entering the site have been noticed. Their populations have been studied. A daily usage mapping as well as weekly usage mapping have been done for these different users. The users would also be the biodiversity, the aquatic fauna, the avifauna of this region as well, and they have also been studied in detail in terms of their activities. The user requirements have been studied. And finally, evident threats which this community faces in terms of ecological and socio-cultural needs has been put together as fragmentation of wetlands, disconnect with the creek, diminishing sponges, and loss of resilience. In terms of the socio-cultural layer, it's the loss of identity, disconnect with the original profession, disconnect with the land, deficient accessible greens, alienation, and a disconnect between the people of the society, between the coolies and the newer migrants. So the design proposal is based on, again, segregated into place and people. The solutions are restoring the intertidal wetland nexus, creating urban resilience, preserving the biodiversity of the region, restoring the indigenous identity of the zone coolies, creating productive landscapes, and bringing people together. So first, let's start with delineating the site and trying to identify the scales of intervention. So one of the biggest scale of intervention is that of the intertidal wetland restoration of about 27 acres, to a scale 2 of reviving one of the community spaces of the Koliwada, to a scale 3 of a very small social node of just 5,000 square feet has been reimagined. So it's about joining these three dots that makes my project. So to understand, so how would, by just making these patches of wetlands accessible to the people of Koliwada and the entire Charkop neighborhood, we add another 10% of open spaces to the neighborhood. So making it to 13%. Then, kind of identifying the cultural markers, identifying the different points from which they would be probably accessing these wetlands, and creating a nexus, a connection of all of these together by joining these dots and identifying pause points and entry points together. So starting with my scale 1 intervention, let's redefine the notion of a neighborhood park. Why are most of our urban parks so generic, so contextually irrelevant, insensitive to regional settings, indifferent to native biodiversity, water intensive and high maintenance? Why can't our urban parks be more functional, urban stormwater managers, ecologically sensitive, contextually rooted sponges of resilience, which are self-sustainable and probably could be productive landscapes as well? So I've done certain case studies on similar lines. So, what the past was of these wetlands to what the present is and what the future of these wetlands could be. Starting with a stormwater management plan for these wetlands, seeing these wetlands as stormwater managers to collect, hold, infiltrate, swell, shrink, and drain. To see these wetlands in different conditions, from a high tide, the capacity it would hold, to a low tide, to a peak monsoon. Then finally coming to the zoning, where the zoning is governed by the salinity ingress also with the side faces, which should be higher, closer to the creek and lesser as you go inland, to the topography, to the adjacent land use and the users, and importantly, the individual as well as social needs of the society. So the primarily I have divided the zoning into four land parcels: zone 1, 2, 3, and 4. The zone 1 being primarily contemplating individualistic, zone 2 being central, hence being social, while zone 3 and 4 being productive landscapes with the Koliwada people as the stakeholders. In terms of the master planning strategies are very simple towards creating an urban resilience as a stormwater management park, restoring the intertidal wetland nexus, creating an ecologically sensitive biodiverse landscape by integrating different typologies of forests or ecosystems as which are appropriate to that condition of land. So I have, I have a green plan of a mangrove forest to marshlands to wetlands to native woodlands to farmlands. So which have been zoned as per the requirements of the adjoining community as well. I have also integrated I have also integrated, so the native woodlands would be probably closer to the Kandivali industrial estate, where they give shade to, where the people from the industrial estate could come in the afternoon and sit here. The productive landscapes are closer again to the community, where they have been envisaged as farmlands, horticulture lands, and fishing grounds also. I have also given a native nursery to promote the native biodiversity, as well as farmers market to create local food cycles. Towards again an accessible productive greens and an inclusive and a participative planning, importantly. So starting with some of my zones and just getting into these zones. So starting with a mangrove forest, which is closer to the creek, which kind of hosts the native biodiversity, and it changes from the tidal variations, and it, where you can actually see the fisher folks coming and, fishing in these waters. Then a bird watching tower, which is closest to the creek, which is at the threshold of the coastal wetlands and the intertidal wetlands, where you could overlook the reserved forest and see the massive avifaunal biodiversity. To certain wetlands, which are created with halophytic grasses along it, along the marshlands, which also have a landscape of toddy palms, which was native to the region once. So you can see the seasonal variations the same landscape could also offer, swelling and shrinking as needed. Also, the whole idea of adaptability, temporality, and multiplicity has been, and taking clues of certain materiality from the landscape of the Koliwada, and then, using it to our advantage by creating these pause points in the landscape. Then the second zone, which is more of a social zone, has a indigenous eatery which opens up to the roadside and which kind of gets camouflaged and slopes down to the wetland. Then the wetland has been made accessible with a physical connect to it. There have been boardwalks which have been proposed along the entire length of this wetland. Certain forest patches, like I said, like an ode to the one gully that once existed, like a dense forest patch has been envisaged, understanding the salt tolerance of the species as well. Again, how seasonally the woodlands would change has also been studied. Then, importantly, where the coastal route would cross over these two wetlands, a physical connect as a skywalk has been given so as to not break the wetlands physically for human access as well. Also coming to my zone 3, which is more about productive landscapes of, having vegetable farms, again, studying the salt tolerance of these species and then planting appropriately. Of having productive landscapes of oysters and mud crab fishing. So, the government of Maharashtra has kind of, as an initiative towards conserving and reviving the wetlands, has incentivized alternate livelihood opportunities like oyster farming, mud crab farming, with giving subsidies as much as 90% to these people. So, optimizing these policies for the benefit of the stakeholders, that is the Koliwadas. So also having certain islands, which were these, natural hillocks, which are there within the landscape, have been repurposed as, these sanctuaries. Having these kind of pause points in between, creating a museum of indigeneity, putting these landscape together, having blurring the boundaries, trying to understand how these boundaries between the wetlands and the neighborhood could be blurred so that people could physically connect to them. Coming to my scale number 2, which is about reviving the community spaces. It is about, like taking the case of a Dingeshwar Talao, how, Dingeshwar Maidan, how it can be repurposed into something on these grounds, where it again accommodates adaptability and kind of meets the different needs of the community. Coming to my scale number 3, which is more about having the visualizing the whole area like an art district, uh, of kind of celebrating the rich culture and kind of having the multiplicity within these smaller nodes as well. So putting the three scales together, it is about having a beautiful canvas of joining these dots together from scale 1 to scale 2 to scale 3, and in a way coming back to my thesis intent and the design intent and where I have reached through the different interventions that I have done. The study of the biodiversity, the native palette that I'll be using. Yeah, and I would like to just I would just ask for a couple of minutes where I would like to show a video which I have made, like a small attempt at what the landscape would actually feel like. If you permit me to, please.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, please go
Yeah,
ahead.
thank you. Sorry.